What really caused the resistance war against America of Vietnam? What happens when a superpower steps into a small, distant country, thinking it can bend history to its will? This isn't just the story of a war, it's the story of how America, with all its might and confidence, found itself trapped in a conflict it never fully understood. The resistance war against America of Vietnam wasn't simply about ideology or territory. It was about people, power, fear, and misjudgment. It began not with bombs, but with intentions, some noble, others clouded by arrogance and misunderstanding. As soldiers marched through dense jungles and leaders debated in distant rooms, a generation questioned everything: authority, truth, and what it meant to be American. So how did it all begin? And more importantly, could it have gone another way? Let's go back to where it started and uncover the choices that led a nation into one of its most painful chapters. Vietnamese history, a legacy of conflict and cultural convergence. Vietnam's history is a complex narrative of enduring conflict and dynastic struggles that have repeatedly led to fragmentation and division. Over the centuries, Vietnam has been deeply shaped by a multitude of cultural influences, most notably from China and India. The notion of a unified Vietnamese identity stretching back 2,000 years is, in reality, a relatively modern invention, constructed amid efforts to consolidate national identity and statehood in the modern era. After centuries of warfare, the conflict that began in 1955, known internationally as the Resistance War against America of Vietnam, emerged as one of the most heavily reported wars in modern history and lasted for 2 decades. The United States believed it was fighting a peasant army and therefore couldn't possibly lose. However, what many Americans failed to grasp was that the Vietnamese people, having experienced generations of warfare, possessed a far deeper understanding of conflict than any foreign power. For them, this was not merely a military engagement. It was a fight for survival and national independence. To American policymakers, the war was a necessary stand against the global spread of communism. Yet despite their intelligence and education, many of these leaders profoundly misunderstood the true nature and scope of the communist threat to the US and the so-called free world. One of the most astonishing aspects of the war is how such well-informed individuals could have been so fundamentally wrong. The 1968 Tet Offensive, during which Viet Cong forces launched surprise attacks across South Vietnam, including a shocking assault on the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, marked a turning point. It severely damaged American morale and turned public opinion decisively against the war. Remarkably, some of the strongest opposition came not from soldiers, but from their mothers, asking, "What is my son doing in Vietnam?" The destruction wrought by this war continues to leave scars even today. Vietnam is geographically defined by 2 major river deltas, the Red River Delta in the north and the Mekong Delta in the south. Archaeological evidence shows that these 3 regions were originally inhabited by 3 distinct ethnic groups: the Vietnamese in the north, the Cham people along the central coast, and the Cambodians in the Mekong Delta. The Cham, likely arriving by sea from the northern coast of Borneo, were exceptional sailors, traders, and seafarers. They spoke a language related to Malay and developed a rich civilization in central Vietnam, heavily influenced by Hinduism and, to a lesser extent, Buddhism from India. For centuries, the Kingdom of Champa dominated the South China Sea, contributing significantly to the cultural and historical tapestry that defines Vietnam today. Tho, too, the shifting tides of trade and belief in early Vietnam. Before the arrival of European colonial powers, the South China Sea was a vibrant artery of commerce, crisscrossed by traders and navigators. It was the Shem, an influential group of seafarers and traders, who initially held sway over this maritime network. Their mastery of sea routes made them instrumental in the exchange of goods, ideas, and cultural practices that flowed through the region. The trade that once connected the coasts of Southeast Asia began to stretch its reach westward, drawing in merchants not only from India and the Middle East, but also increasingly from Europe. As Muslim traders from India and the Arabian Peninsula made their mark along the coasts, the southern Vietnamese kingdom of Champa began to absorb Islamic influences. Over time, much of Champa converted to Islam, integrating it into their social and spiritual fabric. In contrast, the northern and central Vietnamese regions experienced a wave of Christian influence, introduced by European missionaries who followed close on the heels of traders. This dual religious transformation created a stark cultural divide that would influence the region's political future. Tensions between the northern Trinh lords and the southern Nguyen family eventually escalated into full-scale war. In a twist of global interconnection, both sides received military aid from European powers. The Dutch, seeking influence and profit, provided weapons and ships to the northern Trinh regime. Meanwhile, the Portuguese, operating from their strategic base in Macau near present-day Hong Kong, supported the Nguyen dynasty in the south. European gunpowder, firearms, and tactical knowledge were now shaping the internal conflicts of Vietnam. These initial European contacts, led by the Portuguese and Dutch, opened the floodgates for more intensive involvement by Western powers. The British and the French would soon follow, each eager to establish footholds in the increasingly valuable East Asian trade networks. Yet even as these external forces entered the fray, Vietnam was far from a passive stage. Long before European influence became dominant, Vietnam was home to thriving and sophisticated societies. Local kingdoms and cultures had developed intricate systems of governance, urban planning, and spirituality. Rather than being shaped solely by China, much of Vietnam's political and cultural life bore the deep imprint of Indian influence. From religious practices to royal court rituals and temple architecture, the Indian subcontinent had left a profound legacy. This unique synthesis of Indian and local traditions allowed Vietnamese civilizations to stand apart from their neighbors while still engaging with wider regional currents. The story of early Vietnam, then, is not just one of foreign arrival and influence. It is one of adaptation, resilience, and cultural fusion amid the rising tide of global trade and conflict. The enchantment of influence. How France came to command Vietnam. In the distant hum of Southeast Asia's monsoon winds, a profound transformation quietly began to stir. It was not conquest by sword or cannon that first laid the seeds of foreign presence in Vietnam. It was the whisper of unfamiliar prayers, the scent of incense in new chapels, and the softly spoken Latin of Catholic missionaries. Long before the echo of boots on Saigon streets, spiritual envoys from Europe, first Portuguese, then predominantly French, stepped ashore with intentions that would reshape Vietnam's destiny. Although the Portuguese were among the earliest Catholic missionaries to arrive, it was the French missionaries, especially from the mid-17th century onward, who deeply imprinted their presence upon the cultural and spiritual landscape. Of these, Alexandre de Rhodes stands as the most captivating figure. His deep engagement with the Vietnamese language, culminating in the creation of a trilingual dictionary, Vietnamese, Latin, and French, not only made the language more accessible to outsiders, but also became a gateway for growing foreign influence. This linguistic bridge gradually unmoored many Vietnamese from Confucian traditions and guided them toward the tenets of Roman Catholicism. This religious pivot, however, did not sit well with the Vietnamese imperial court. The emperor, alarmed by the increasing number of conversions and what he perceived as the erosion of native values, retaliated with brutal force. Missionaries were executed, an act that signaled the end of amicable trade relations and ushered in a new chapter of suspicion, aggression, and ultimately, colonization. France, unlike other European powers who already held dominions in Asia, the British in India, the Portuguese in the Philippines, the Dutch in Indonesia, saw in Vietnam both a strategic opportunity and a moral pretext cloaked in the rhetoric of protection and civilization. The French response was deliberate and calculated. By 1860, they had seized areas near Saigon. Over the next 2 decades, their military forces crept northward and inland, piecing together dominion province by province. This gradual conquest saw the complete colonization of the Mekong Delta and the creation of a new French colony, Cochinchina. For the first time in its history, Vietnam was divided into 3 administrative regions: Tonkin in the north, Annam in the center, and Cochinchina in the south. In October 1887, the transformation was formalized. French Indochina was born, a colonial federation that included Vietnam, Cambodia, and later Laos in 1893. The consequences of this colonial enterprise would echo for generations, entwining the fates of France and Vietnam in a complex dance of domination, resistance, and cultural fusion. What began as a spiritual mission had, by stealth and strategy, become an imperial dominion. Whispers of empire, the seeds of a divided Vietnam. In the soft twilight of Southeast Asia, where rice fields stretch endlessly and rivers whisper ancient secrets, Vietnam stood as a land shaped by centuries of resilience. But in the late 19th century, this proud and war-weathered nation found itself entangled in the ambitions of a distant empire. It was not the clash of neighboring dynasties or tribal feuds that now loomed, but the calculated gaze of France, an empire hungry for power and prestige. By 1884, the French had cemented their grip on Vietnam, slicing it into 3 administrative regions: Tonkin in the north, Annam through the heart, and Cochinchina in the south. Beneath the guise of civilizing mission, they overlaid Vietnamese society with French laws, education, language, and cultural institutions. Cafes serving baguettes appeared beside ancient pagodas. School children recited Voltaire even as they bowed to their ancestors. Yet this transformation was no peaceful evolution. It was a colonization cloaked in civility. France's influence did more than change Vietnam's political landscape. It fractured its soul. Internal divisions grew, with the country increasingly split between traditionalists, reformists, and revolutionaries. Centuries of local conflict now gave way to a deeper, more ideological struggle. The seeds of nationalism, nourished by humiliation and oppression, began to sprout, only to be later entwined with the doctrines of communism, fueled by neighboring China and the distant Soviet Union. Into this charged atmosphere would step another superpower, the United States. But how did Vietnam, a nation so far removed from the American homeland, become the stage for one of the most devastating and controversial wars of the 20th century? If the French in Vietnam, a complicated beginning. When people think about colonialism, They often imagine a simple story of one country taking over another. But the reality in Vietnam during the French conquest was much more complex. Not all Vietnamese were against the French. In fact, some supported them, especially certain groups like Catholics, who hoped for better treatment under French rule. Others believed that France could help modernize the country and bring new opportunities. At the time, Vietnam was going through major changes. Some Vietnamese people saw benefits in siding with the French. For example, in the southern region of the Mekong Delta, land was given to Vietnamese who cooperated with the colonial powers. This led to the rise of a new class of landowners, wealthy Vietnamese who began to profit from the new system. As French control grew, they didn't just bring their army, they brought their way of life. In many towns, the French built law courts, schools, and administrative buildings. These places weren't just for French people. Eventually, wealthy Vietnamese families also wanted their children to attend these schools and learn the French language and customs. Education became a symbol of success and status. One big change was the introduction of a new writing system. The Latin-based alphabet, known as Quoc Ngu, national language, replaced the old Chinese characters. This made reading and writing easier for ordinary people and opened the door to new ideas from the West, including political movements like communism and nationalism. In this environment, a young man named Ho Chi Minh grew up. He was educated in French schools and later traveled around the world as a sailor and worker. While living abroad, in places like the United States, Britain, and France, he saw how other people lived and started to think deeply about freedom and justice for Vietnam. At first, he hoped the West would support Vietnamese independence, but after being ignored by leaders like U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, Ho Chi Minh turned to communism, believing it offered a path to true independence. By the time he returned to Vietnam in 1941, he had become a well-known and respected figure, ready to lead the movement for a free Vietnam. 6. Ho Chi Minh and the struggle for Vietnamese independence. At the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, a young Vietnamese nationalist named Ho Chi Minh made an unexpected appearance. Representing a call for freedom from French colonial rule, he presented a petition demanding independence for the Vietnamese people. His efforts were quickly dismissed, and he was expelled from Versailles. At that time, Ho Chi Minh was a member of the French Socialist Party, which in the same year experienced a significant split. Choosing his ideological path, he aligned with the communist faction that would soon establish the French Communist Party. During World War II, after the fall of France to Nazi Germany in June 1940, the collaborationist Vichy regime ceded control of key Vietnamese cities, Saigon and Hanoi, to the Japanese. Japan, seeking to sever Allied supply routes through Southeast Asia, justified its military presence in Vietnam. After being released from prison in China, Ho Chi Minh returned to Vietnam and assumed leadership of the independence movement. Under his command, the Viet Minh organized resistance efforts against both Japanese occupiers and the remnants of French colonial authority. Collaborating with General Von Nguyen Giap and other revolutionaries, Ho Chi Minh re-entered China and established a communist resistance force targeting Japanese forces. By 1945, the Viet Minh had gained control over northern Vietnam. Meanwhile, in the south, British forces, acting under the guise of liberating former colonies, allowed rearmed Japanese troops to maintain order until the French could reassert their control. Ironically, the Japanese, once invaders themselves, were now entrusted by the British to prevent communist uprisings. Throughout this period, the Vietnamese Communist Party, founded by Ho Chi Minh in 1930, remained the only major political entity actively opposing both the French and the Japanese. When World War II concluded and both foreign powers were defeated, the communists, who had established deep-rooted nationalist support, were in a commanding position to take control of Vietnam's future. Ho Chi Minh, often referred to affectionately as Uncle Ho by the Vietnamese, became a symbol of resilience and patriotism. Many believed he was not only a leader, but a guiding spirit in their struggle. Though undeniably ambitious, his vision of an independent Vietnam resonated widely among a population exhausted by foreign domination. His leadership saw a series of effective military campaigns supported clandestinely by the United States Office of Strategic Services. Notably, Ho Chi Minh's forces aided in rescuing downed Allied pilots and facilitating their return via southern China, thereby forming a brief but strategic alliance with the United States. This cooperation allowed him to strengthen the Viet Minh militarily, setting the stage for the eventual seizure of power following Japan's surrender. 7 historical developments in Vietnam since 1945 and the struggle against colonialism. Since 1945, Vietnam underwent significant transformations under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, who successfully built a formidable military force. At that time, the country was enduring a devastating famine that claimed the lives of approximately 2 million Vietnamese. The local population largely blamed the French colonialists and the Japanese occupiers, who had seized rice supplies to feed their own troops and even exported rice back to Japan, leaving the Vietnamese people starving. After Japan handed over control of Vietnam to the Viet Minh in 1945, a new era began. However, the end of World War II ushered in a series of new conflicts, especially in Indochina, where the resistance war against America of Vietnam eventually erupted. This war was inherited by the United States after the French failed to maintain their hold on the region. Ironically, Ho Chi Minh had initially been an ally of the U.S. during the anti-Japanese struggle, but shifts in American foreign policy, which had come to focus heavily on containing communism, turned Vietnam into a battleground in the global Cold War strategy. The U.S. government promoted the domino theory, which held that if South Vietnam fell to communism, neighboring countries such as Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and even nations further south like Malaysia and Australia would follow. One American senator famously warned, "We don't want to start fighting them when they land on Wiki Beach." Key U.S. policymakers like Robert McNamara and Dean Rusk genuinely believed that the Vietnam conflict marked the start of a global communist takeover, a belief that, in hindsight, proved deeply flawed. The war against the French began in earnest in December 1946, when the Viet Minh launched attacks in Hanoi. What followed was a brutal and prolonged conflict that lasted until 1954. During this time, violence and destruction swept across French Indochina, with French forces struggling to hold territory, while Vietnamese nationalist sentiment continued to grow. The French refusal to grant Vietnam true independence only fueled support for the Viet Minh, the only organized and capable force at the time advocating for self-determination. By the time of the critical Battle of Dien Bien Phu, President Eisenhower declined to authorize U.S. airstrikes in support of the French. Meanwhile, Ho Chi Minh adeptly secured aid from the Soviet Union, restrained Chinese involvement, and relied on the military genius of General Vo Nguyen Giap. This combination of strategic diplomacy and tactical brilliance ultimately led to a decisive Vietnamese victory, marking the end of French colonial rule and the beginning of a new chapter in the nation's fight for sovereignty. The First Indochina War, seeds of division, and the Cold War's reach. As World War II faded into history, a new and volatile conflict erupted in Southeast Asia, the First Indochina War. This brutal struggle, beginning in 1946, pitted French colonial forces against a growing Vietnamese independence movement, primarily led by the communist Viet Minh under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh. The war would become a crucible for competing ideologies, national liberation, and geopolitical maneuvering, with consequences that would echo across the globe. In the early years, France, determined to reclaim its colonial hold over Indochina, faced growing resistance. Vietnamese forces, many inspired by nationalist ideals and others driven by communist ideology, took to the dense jungles and rice paddies in a fierce guerrilla campaign. After the fall of China to Mao Zedong's communist regime in 1949 and the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950, the Cold War dynamic intensified. The United States, initially hesitant to back a colonial power, shifted course. Keen to secure French support in NATO and to contain the perceived domino effect of communism in Asia, the U.S. began providing France with substantial political, financial, and military aid. By 1950, America was bankrolling roughly 80% of France's military expenditure in Indochina. American advisors and weaponry flowed into the region, with French forces flying American-made aircraft and coordinating assaults against communist units in strategic locations like the Hanoi Delta. Meanwhile, China extended its support to the Viet Minh, further internationalizing what had begun as a colonial war. The war's cost was steep, not only in economic terms, but in human suffering. Entire villages were caught in the crossfire. Civilians fled the violence in droves, women, children, and the elderly trudging toward temporary sanctuaries behind French lines. The emotional toll was immense, as Vietnamese communities were fractured and loyalties divided between visions of nationalism, communism, and survival. For the Vietnamese fighters, the war was deeply personal. Some joined to expel foreign occupiers, others sought to dismantle entrenched systems of landlord power and inequality. While global powers fought over ideology, many Vietnamese were simply fighting for a future free from domination. The turning point came in 1954, at the climactic Battle of Dien Bien Phu. In a daring but ultimately disastrous move, French forces established a fortified base, hoping to draw the Viet Minh into open battle. Instead, they were besieged and defeated by General Vo Nguyen Giap's forces in a stunning display of strategic brilliance. This defeat marked the end of the First Indochina War. At the Geneva Conference, France agreed to withdraw, and Vietnam was temporarily divided along the 17th parallel. The North became the Democratic Republic of Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh, while the South was declared the State of Vietnam under Emperor Bao Dai. This division, intended as a short-term measure, laid the groundwork for a far more devastating conflict, the resistance war against America of Vietnam, when the illusion of freedom, the U.S. gamble in South Vietnam. In the aftermath of World War II, the world stood at the edge of a new ideological divide. As the Cold War intensified, Vietnam became a chessboard in the great power struggle between capitalism and communism. Amid the smoke of colonial retreat and revolutionary fervor, the United States found itself ensnared in a narrative of hope, fear, and, ultimately, miscalculation. Following the 1954 Geneva Accords, Vietnam was temporarily split into two halves along the 17th parallel. The North, under the communist leadership of Ho Chi Minh, and the South, under the emerging leadership of Ngo Dinh Diem. While the division was intended as a short-term measure leading to national elections within 2 years, this promise quickly dissolved under geopolitical anxiety. The United States, apprehensive about the popularity of Ho Chi Minh in the North and the possibility of a communist electoral victory, began to maneuver strategically to prevent reunification under communist rule. Diem, a staunch anti-communist with deep Catholic roots, returned to Vietnam from exile with U.S. support and a symbolic endorsement from the last emperor, Bao Dai. Yet, rather than preserving the monarchy as a figurehead, Diem orchestrated a referendum that ousted Bao Dai and exiled him to France. Diem then declared himself president of the Republic of Vietnam, consolidating power with an iron grip. This decision was not merely political, it was psychological. The U.S., still haunted by the scars of the Korean War, saw Vietnam through a distorted lens. They feared another domino falling in Southeast Asia, and in Diem they saw a bulwark against the tide of communism. To Washington, he was problematic, authoritarian, and increasingly unpopular. But he was their man. As one American general bluntly stated, "He's a son of A, but he's our son of A." Meanwhile, in the North, Ho Chi Minh's government remained deeply committed to reunification. In 1960, they supported the formation of the National Liberation Front, NLF, widely known in the South as the Viet Cong. This group began a relentless campaign of guerrilla warfare, targeting Diem's regime and sowing seeds of resistance throughout rural South Vietnam. While Saigon remained the administrative and symbolic capital of the South, the dream of a free and united Vietnam unraveled. The promise of democratic elections faded into myth as U.S. policy shifted from temporary support to permanent entanglement. By the time the French suffered their humiliating defeat at Dien Bien Phu, it became clear that the colonial era had ended, but a new era of foreign interference had just begun. America's attempt to engineer an independent South Vietnam was based less on local legitimacy and more on strategic illusion. In trying to contain communism, they ignored the voices of the Vietnamese people, propping up a regime that ruled through fear rather than consent. What was meant to be a beacon of freedom became, in time, a warning against the dangers of ideological obsession and misplaced loyalty. 10 whispers of conflict, the lure of Vietnam's Crossroads. In the haze of post-World War II uncertainty, when empires were dissolving and ideologies rose like tides against colonial shorelines, Vietnam emerged, not merely as a distant land, but as a battleground of global visions. In the gentle swaying of its rice paddies and the murmur of its villages, a deeper turmoil was brewing, one that would soon captivate, then entangle the world's most powerful nations. To the untrained eye, Vietnam, in the early 1950s, might have seemed like just another former colony in transition. But beneath that surface lay a stage set for a conflict that would blur lines between liberation and domination, nationalism and ideology. By 1954, the scars of French colonialism were still fresh, and the defeat at Dien Bien Phu signaled the crumbling of European influence in Southeast Asia. The Geneva Accords temporarily split the nation at the 17th parallel, but the ideological battle lines had already been drawn. Half of Vietnam's villages had aligned with communist forces, not because of coercion alone, but because many saw in Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh a promise of independence, equality, and the end of foreign domination. The allure of communism in Vietnam was not just political, it was deeply emotional and nationalist. To Western eyes, especially in Washington, the red hue of revolution stretching across Asia seemed to bleed too close to strategic interests. The Cold War mindset, tinged with fear and idealism, cast Soviet-style communism as a contagious threat that had to be stopped. There was no grand American conspiracy to dominate Vietnam, but rather a deeply rooted anxiety that if Vietnam fell to communism, so too might Laos, Cambodia, and perhaps beyond. This is what later became known as the domino theory. Thus, when the South Vietnamese government under Ngo Dinh Diem took power, the United States quickly offered its hand, not just in friendship, but in calculated support. Diem, needing to assert control, turned on powerful religious and political sects in the Mekong Delta, sparking violent clashes in the streets of Saigon throughout 1954 and 1955. What unfolded was not just political unrest, it was the opening chapter of a long, bitter struggle, one in which hopes for independence, fears of tyranny, and foreign ambitions would all collide. 11. A brief history of Vietnam's struggle before the war. In the 20th century, Vietnam went through many major events that shaped its path toward war. For much of the early 1900s, Vietnam was under the control of France, which made it part of a colony called French Indochina. During this time, the French brought their language, education system, and culture to Vietnam, but they also exploited the land and people for their own benefit. Many Vietnamese people were unhappy with this rule and wanted their country to be free and independent. France wasn't the only foreign power that tried to control Vietnam. At different points in history, China had also invaded and influenced the region. This long history of outside interference created a strong desire among the Vietnamese for self-rule and national pride. After World War II, the Vietnamese fought a long and difficult war against the French to win their independence. This conflict came to a turning point in 1954 at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, where Vietnamese forces defeated the French army. This victory led to the Geneva Peace Conference, where world leaders decided to temporarily divide Vietnam into two parts. The North was given to the communist-led Democratic Republic of Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh, while the South was controlled by a government led by Ngo Dinh Diem, with strong support from the United States. The U.S. supported South Vietnam because they were afraid of the spread of communism. During the Cold War, America saw communism as a serious threat and wanted to stop it from spreading in Asia. Ho Chi Minh and his followers in the North, including a group called the National Liberation Front, or Viet Cong, wanted to reunite the country under communist rule. They began an uprising in the South and gained support from many ordinary people, especially farmers and villagers who felt left out by the Southern government. Unlike other political groups, the communists were well organized and focused on reaching people in the countryside. They were able to build strong networks in the North, Central, and even parts of the South. Meanwhile, religious groups and political parties in the South had a harder time gaining support outside their local areas. By the early 1960s, the conflict had grown more serious. The U.S. sent thousands of military advisors to help train South Vietnamese forces. What started as a small support mission slowly turned into a much bigger war, with increasing numbers of American troops being sent to Vietnam. This marked the beginning of deeper U.S. involvement in what would become one of the most controversial wars in modern history. 12. The unraveling of South Vietnam, a struggle for sovereignty. South Vietnam found itself under relentless attack, sometimes through isolated acts of violence by lone assassins, at other times by coordinated guerrilla units, and more recently, by full-scale battalion assaults. The turbulence was not confined within Vietnam's borders. Neighboring nations like Burma, Cambodia, and India experienced repeated violations of their once peaceful frontiers. The fragile independence of Laos, freshly won, now stood on the brink of collapse. Faced with this volatile landscape, the United States concluded that without a major strategic shift, South Vietnam would succumb quickly. As a result, America committed itself to the conflict, deploying regular troops on a large scale. Historical tensions further complicated the situation. The Chinese, whether communist or nationalist, had long been at odds with the Vietnamese, but it was the shadow of Soviet communism that loomed largest in American eyes. With Mao Zedong's rise in China, aided by the Soviets, the U.S. perceived a growing, menacing force in Asia. This ideological dread shaped an urgent narrative. A monster had been created, and it now needed to be confronted. Still, the reality on the ground remained ambiguous. As the popular refrain echoed, "There's something happening here, but what it is ain't exactly clear." President Kennedy himself was torn. He recognized the strategic importance of South Vietnam, but was aware of the deepening crisis. Despite substantial U.S. aid, by mid-1963, South Vietnam's military showed little progress against the Viet Cong insurgents. The government led by President Ngo Dinh Diem appeared increasingly vulnerable. As internal tensions escalated, Diem's regime crumbled amid a military coup. In the days before his assassination, Diem showed no signs of anticipating his grim fate. After hours of bombardment against the presidential palace, the white flag was eventually raised. Diem and his brother attempted to escape in disguise, but were captured and killed while being transported to prison. Their deaths marked a pivotal turn in the chaos engulfing South Vietnam. 13. The turning point, the aftermath of President Kennedy's assassination and Johnson's rise to power. 3 weeks following a calm period in the United States, the nation would be shaken to its core by an event that would forever change its history. On November 22, 1963, at precisely 1:25 p.m., President John F. Kennedy's motorcade rolled into downtown Dallas, Texas. Only 6 minutes remained before tragedy struck. Hidden inside a warehouse, a sniper lay in wait, rifle steady, eyes focused. The cheers and excitement of the gathered crowd nearly drowned out the sound of 3 fatal gunshots. But the assassin's aim was precise. From Dallas, the news spread swiftly. Initial reports confirmed that President Kennedy had died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, or 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, approximately 38 minutes before the public was officially informed. In the immediate chaos that followed, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson was swiftly escorted from the hospital, his destination undisclosed at first. However, it was soon understood that he would be taking the oath of office, thus becoming the 36th President of the United States. Johnson's sudden ascent to power came at a time of great national sorrow and uncertainty. Among the most urgent matters he inherited was the escalating conflict in Vietnam, a situation that had increasingly occupied Kennedy's attention in his final months. Although Johnson possessed many admirable qualities, foreign policy was not considered his strong suit. Having served in the Navy during World War II in the Pacific Theater, Johnson was convinced of 2 principles: that overwhelming military force could achieve victory, and that bold negotiation tactics, like those he used in domestic politics, could yield international results. However, He misjudged the resolve of North Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh, who had no intention of compromising. Confident in the eventual outcome, the Vietnamese leadership focused on managing their losses, ensuring that casualties remained lower than their birth rate. In this way, they were able to sustain the war effort, undeterred by American military pressure. Thus, Johnson's presidency began under the shadow of a fallen leader, with the burden of a growing war and a nation in mourning. 14. The Gulf of Tonkin Incident, a turning point in the resistance war against America of Vietnam. In August 1964, an event off the coast of the Gulf of Tonkin set in motion a dramatic escalation of American involvement in Vietnam. This incident not only shaped the course of U.S. foreign policy, but also raised enduring questions about the justification and transparency behind war decisions. President Lyndon B. Johnson, who had assumed the presidency after the assassination of John F. Kennedy in November 1963, was thrust into the center of a rapidly evolving geopolitical conflict. At the time, Johnson faced two major fronts: a domestic war on poverty and an international struggle against the spread of communism. Despite the growing strength of the Viet Cong and increased communist influence in Southeast Asia, Johnson had, up until this point, refrained from a full-scale military escalation in Vietnam. That restraint ended with what became known as the Gulf of Tonkin Incident. On August 2, 1964, the U.S. destroyer USS Maddox was conducting a routine patrol in international waters off the North Vietnamese coast. According to initial reports, 3 North Vietnamese torpedo boats approached and allegedly fired on the Maddox, prompting a U.S. response that damaged the attackers. 2 days later, on August 4th, a second incident was reported involving the Maddox and another destroyer, the USS Turner Joy. This time, however, evidence was murky. The captain of the Maddox later suggested that the perceived attack may have been a result of foul weather or misinterpreted sonar readings. Despite this retraction, President Johnson ordered retaliatory airstrikes on North Vietnamese targets, including torpedo boat bases and an oil depot. Johnson's reaction was swift and resolute. He presented the incident as an unprovoked act of aggression, stating that it would redouble the determination of all Americans to carry out our full commitment to the people and to the government of South Vietnam. His firm stance won him broad political support and paved the way for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, passed overwhelmingly by Congress. This resolution granted Johnson broad authority to use military force in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. The Gulf of Tonkin incident marked a turning point. It effectively opened the door to a full-scale U.S. military engagement in Vietnam. What followed was a protracted and deeply controversial conflict that claimed the lives of over 58,000 American soldiers and millions of Vietnamese. To this day, the events of August 1964 remain shrouded in debate. The incident has come to symbolize the danger of hasty decisions based on unclear intelligence, and it continues to provoke reflection on the limits of executive power, the need for accountability, and the true cost of war. 15. The Hypnotic March into the Maelstrom, America's deepening Vietnam commitment. In the stillness of a troubled world, a storm was quietly brewing across the Pacific. It began with whispers in the halls of power, murmurs that quickly turned into roars as the United States inched ever closer to the furnace of war in Vietnam. President Lyndon B. Johnson, a master of persuasion and political maneuvering, did not have to plead for long. Congress, trusting in his vision and rhetoric, handed him near unanimous approval through what would become the infamous Gulf of Tonkin resolution. This resolution, often likened by Johnson to grandmother's nightshirt because it covered everything, became a carte blanche, an open-ended ticket to war, veiled in patriotic duty. The official story was simple, almost sterile. American ships, allegedly attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin, needed protection. Johnson's solemn televised address declared to the nation renewed hostile actions against United States ships require a positive reply. The message was clear. Retaliation would come not with caution, but with force. Aircraft took flight. Bombs fell like thunder over the north, and the spiral of war began its unrelenting spin. As the bombs rained down, another sound echoed across America: music. Protest songs like Eve of Destruction gave voice to the growing disillusionment. "You're old enough to kill, but not for voting," the lyrics mourned, cutting into the American conscience like a blade. The generation called upon to fight was questioning the very reasons they were sent. War was no longer distant. It was broadcast into living rooms, woven into headlines, and etched into the hearts of families from coast to coast. On the ground in South Vietnam, the conflict escalated rapidly. What began as an advisory mission swelled into a full-scale military commitment. The number of U.S. troops surged from just 12,000 in 1962 to over 200,000 by the end of 1965. With every deployment, with every name added to the draft list, the war became less a foreign engagement and more a domestic reality. College campuses erupted in protest. Young men burned their draft cards. Families waited in dread for news from Southeast Asia. In a cruel twist, American escalation triggered an equal and opposite reaction. The Viet Cong, South Vietnam's communist insurgents, saw their recruitment quadruple from 1964 to 1965. As American boots pounded the jungle floor, so too did the guerrilla resistance multiply. The war became not just a struggle of ideologies, but of sheer numbers and unyielding will. And thus, the hypnotic march into the heart of the Maelstrom continued, pulled by promises of freedom, wrapped in flags, and shadowed by the specter of destruction. 16. The illusion of control, the dawning storm in Vietnam. It began not with an explosion, but with a promise. Solemn, echoing, irresistible. President Lyndon B. Johnson stood before the American people with confidence that cloaked the storm gathering in Southeast Asia. Beneath the polished speeches and televised optimism, a war machine was awakening, driven not by necessity, but by the ghost of containment, the fear of communism, and the illusion that firepower could mold nations. Though voices within the United States called for restraint and reflection, Johnson's administration moved in a different direction. The memory of President Kennedy's cautious approach to Vietnam was fading, replaced by a rising tide of political will to expand U.S. involvement. Johnson, freshly endorsed by a landslide electoral victory, was buoyed by a surge in nationalistic sentiment. The campaign promises of peace and progress blurred into the first commands of escalation. Within a year, Operation Rolling Thunder was unleashed, a sustained aerial bombardment of North Vietnam that would last over 3 years. It was not merely a military tactic, but a psychological campaign intended to break the will of the North Vietnamese leadership and cut the supply lines feeding southern insurgencies. Yet what followed was not submission, but adaptation. The jungles, trails, and villages became both refuge and battleground. American firepower, overwhelming in scale, proved clumsy against an enemy that moved through tunnels, forests, and shadows. As the bombs fell, so too did the illusions of a quick victory. The northern regulars poured into South Vietnam, reinforcing a communist presence already embedded among rural villagers. The Viet Cong, resilient and elusive, waged guerrilla warfare that confounded American forces. Meanwhile, South Vietnamese cities swelled with refugees fleeing the scorched countryside, where napalm and Agent Orange turned lush ecosystems into lifeless ash. Livelihoods were lost. Trust in both governments, American and South Vietnamese, eroded. Despite the destruction, Johnson remained resolute. He invoked the national pledge to protect South Vietnam's sovereignty, framing the war as a moral duty. But behind his unwavering words, dissent brewed. Universities erupted in protest. Civil rights leaders began to link the war abroad with the injustices at home. Yet in Saigon, in the jungles of Quang Tri, in the secret tunnels of Cu Chi, the war pressed on, driven by momentum, misjudgment, and the ever-deepening tragedy of a nation caught in the crosshairs of ideology. The war in Vietnam had not only begun, it had taken root, sprawling across continents, bleeding through political speeches and burning into the consciousness of a generation. This was only the beginning of a war that would rage on for years, a war that would leave lasting impacts on both Vietnam and America for decades to come. And when the man waved "Hail to the Chief," it was you they were pointing the cannon at. But it ain't me. It ain't me. I ain't no senator's son. If you found this story insightful, don't forget to like and follow for more. There's still so much history left to uncover. Join us on the journey.